The Vampire King's newborn wouldn't stop shrieking at 30,000 feet until single mother Maya pressed her palm to the baby's forehead. The entire cabin fell silent as golden light pulsed between them. But what the ancient ruler didn't expect was for this human woman to drain his son's supernatural fever, revealing she possessed magic that could either save or destroy his entire bloodline. Maya Castellanos pressed her face against the small airplane window and watched Boston disappear into darkness below. The forged passport tucked inside her jacket pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but the sleeping 3-year-old curled against her shoulder was all that mattered now. Lucia's dark curls spilled across the worn fabric of Maya's sweater, and for the first time in months, her daughter looked peaceful. The bruises on Maya's wrist had faded to yellow, but the memory of Marcus's fingers digging into her skin still made her stomach clench. 3 days ago, she had emptied their joint savings account, booked this red-eye flight to London, and walked away from the only life she had ever known. The job interview at the private medical clinic in Kensington was real. She had made sure of that. But everything else about her escape plan balanced on lies and desperation. Marcus would discover she was gone when he returned from his shift at the Boston Police Department, and his connections would help him track her down within hours, unless she could disappear completely into another country's bureaucracy. The flight attendant had smiled sympathetically when Maya had explained that Lucia might be restless during the overnight journey. But the cabin was nearly empty except for a handful of business travelers in first class who had boarded with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to international travel. Maya had chosen the cheapest seats in the back of the plane, as far from the expensive passengers as possible, where she could blend into the shadows and nurse her anxiety in private. The engines hummed steadily as they climbed toward cruising altitude, and Maya allowed herself to imagine stepping off the plane in London as someone new, someone free, someone who could give Lucia the life she deserved. Then the crying began. It started as a low wail from somewhere in first class, but within minutes it had escalated into a piercing shriek that cut through the engine noise like broken glass. Maya felt Lucia stir in her arms and quickly began stroking her daughter's hair, whispering the Spanish lullabies her grandmother had taught her years ago. Other passengers shifted restlessly in their seats, craning their necks toward the source of the disturbance, but no one moved to investigate. The flight attendants hurried forward with bottles and blankets, their professional smiles tight with strain, but Maya could hear them being dismissed with sharp, clipped words, spoken in an accent she could not place. The crying continued for an hour, then two, a sound of such raw desperation that it made Maya's chest ache with sympathy. She had walked the floors with Lucia during those first terrible months after Marcus had started drinking, bouncing and rocking and singing until her own voice was hoarse, so she recognized the particular quality of this infant's distress. This was not hunger or discomfort, or even illness. This was pain. When Lucia finally opened her sleepy eyes and asked why the baby was crying, Maya found herself standing before she had consciously decided to move. She settled Lucia into her seat with quiet instructions to stay put and walked toward first class, past the invisible boundary that separated economy passengers from those who could afford leather seats and real silverware. The cabin felt different here, colder somehow, as if the air itself had weight and substance that pressed against her skin. Other passengers avoided looking directly at the source of the crying, their eyes sliding away as if they could not quite focus on what sat in the front row. Maya felt her own vision blur for a moment, then sharpen with sudden clarity as she approached the tall man cradling the screaming infant. He was pale in a way that suggested he had never seen sunlight, with sharp cheekbones and black hair that fell across his forehead in waves. His coat was expensive, tailored to his lean frame, but his white shirt was stained with what looked like blood. The baby in his arms could not have been more than a few weeks old, but his tiny face was flushed with fever, and his small fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. Heat radiated from the infant's body like a furnace, and Maya could smell something metallic and strange in the air around them. The man looked up as she approached, and Maya saw eyes the color of winter storms, pale gray with flecks of silver that seemed to catch the cabin lights. His skin had an almost translucent quality, as if she could see the veins beneath the surface, and when he spoke, his accent carried the weight of centuries. Impossible, he whispered, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to step backward. You are human. Maya had no idea what he meant by that, but the baby in his arms was burning with a fever that would kill him if it continued much longer. Without thinking, without permission, without any plan beyond the maternal instinct that had carried her through 3 years of raising Lucia alone, Maya reached out and pressed her palm to the infant's forehead. Golden light erupted between them like captured sunlight, warm and bright and impossibly beautiful. The baby's cries stopped instantly as something flowed from Maya's hand into his small body, drawing the supernatural heat out like poison being pulled from a wound. The entire cabin fell silent. Even the engines seemed to quiet. And Maya watched in shock as her palm glowed with soft, healing radiance she had never seen before. The light pulsed in time with her heartbeat, connecting her to the infant in a way that felt ancient and inevitable and completely beyond her understanding. She could feel his pain flowing into her, could sense the strange fever that had been consuming him from within, could taste metal and starlight and something that might have been magic on her tongue. The baby's face relaxed into peaceful sleep, his tiny fists unclenching as the burning heat faded from his skin. Maya stared at her hand, still glowing faintly gold, and realized that whatever had just happened had changed everything. The man holding the baby continued to stare at her with those storm-colored eyes, his expression shifting from shock to awe to something that might have been calculation. She wanted to ask what was wrong with the infant, wanted to demand an explanation for the light that had come from her own skin, wanted to run back to her seat and pretend none of this had happened. Instead, she found herself asking, "What is wrong with him?" "Everything," the man replied, his voice carrying weight that made the air itself feel heavy. "And you just saved his life." Maya looked down at the peaceful baby and felt something shift inside her chest, a connection she could not name or understand, but knew she would never be able to break. The golden light faded from her palm, but not from her awareness, as if it had always been there waiting for her to notice it. She thought of Lucia waiting in economy class, of the new life she had planned in London, of Marcus and the bruises and the desperate gamble that had brought her to this moment at 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. She thought of her grandmother's stories about women who could heal with their hands, tales she had dismissed as folklore until tonight. She thought of the impossible choice she had made to help a stranger's child, and wondered if saving one life might have cost her the freedom she had sacrificed everything to achieve. The man was watching her with an expression she could not read, and Maya realized that whatever had just happened between her and the baby, it was only the beginning. The plane continued its journey toward London, carrying her toward a future she had never imagined, where golden light flowed from her hands and mysterious strangers spoke of ancient laws and binding debts, where the unthinkable had become possible and nothing would ever be the same. The moment the plane touched down at Heathrow, Maya knew something had fundamentally changed about her life. Dorian Ashworth, as the pale stranger had introduced himself during the remainder of their flight, moved through the terminal like he owned it, and perhaps in ways she couldn't understand, he did. Airport security guards stepped aside without seeming to notice they were doing so, their eyes sliding past him as if he were made of shadow rather than flesh. The baby Raphael slept peacefully in his father's arms now, but Maya could still feel the echo of that golden connection humming beneath her skin, a warmth that had nothing to do with the recycled air of the terminal building. She carried Lucia through the crowds of early morning travelers, following Dorian past customs checkpoints where officials never asked to see his passport, past security stations where metal detectors remained mysteriously silent, past baggage claims where luggage appeared without explanation. Maya clutched her own forged documents and waited for someone to stop them, to ask questions she couldn't answer, but no one even looked in their direction. It was as if Dorian existed in a pocket of space that ordinary people simply couldn't perceive, and by walking beside him, Maya and Lucia had become part of that invisible world. She began to notice other figures in the shadows of Terminal 5, pale men and women in expensive suits who bowed slightly as Dorian passed, their movements too fluid and graceful to be entirely human. They watched Maya with curious eyes that reflected light like a cat's, and she realized she had stumbled into something far larger and more ancient than one sick baby on an airplane. When Dorian led them toward a private exit she hadn't known existed, Maya felt her phone buzzing insistently in her pocket. 7 missed calls from Marcus, each one time-stamped closer together as his panic and rage escalated. She could picture him pacing their Boston apartment, realizing that she had taken Lucia and disappeared, calling in favors from his police contacts to track her credit cards and passport usage. The digital footprint of her escape would lead him straight to London, and Marcus had never been the type of man to let anyone leave him without consequences. Dorian noticed her hesitation and stopped walking, studying her face with those storm-colored eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. "We need to discuss the debt you have incurred," he said quietly, and Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had helped a sick child because every instinct in her body had demanded it, but apparently, that simple act of compassion had consequences she couldn't have imagined. "The ancient laws that govern our kind are quite specific about bloodline interference," Dorian continued, and Maya realized he was no longer speaking with the careful politeness he had maintained on the airplane. His voice carried authority that made other travelers unconsciously step away from them, creating a circle of empty space in the bustling terminal. "You touched my son with magic that should not exist in human hands, and by doing so you have bound yourself to us until the obligation is fulfilled." Maya wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she had no idea what magic he was talking about, that she was just a woman running from an abusive marriage with her daughter and a job interview in London. But she could still feel the golden light humming beneath her skin, could still taste starlight and metal on her tongue, could still sense the connection between herself and the sleeping infant in Dorian's arms. Whatever had happened on that airplane, it was real and permanent and completely beyond her understanding of how the world worked. When she tried to step away, tried to move toward the public areas of the terminal where security cameras and ordinary people might offer some protection, Dorian's hand closed around her wrist with gentle but immovable strength. "The covenant requires repayment," he said, and Maya felt the weight of centuries in those words. "You touched my bloodline, and by our laws, you are bound to us until the debt is settled." She looked down at his fingers wrapped around her arm and noticed that his skin was cold, far too cold for someone who had just spent hours in the warm cabin of an airplane. His grip didn't hurt, but she couldn't break free of it any more than she could have moved a mountain with her bare hands. Lucia pressed closer to Maya's side, sensing her mother's fear even if she couldn't understand its source. And Maya realized that whatever choice she made in this moment would affect both their lives irrevocably. Marcus would find them if they stayed in the public world, but following Dorian into whatever shadow realm he inhabited might be an even greater danger. Yet as she looked at the peaceful baby sleeping against his father's chest, she knew she couldn't walk away from the connection that still pulsed between them like a heartbeat made of light. Dorian led them through corridors that didn't appear on any airport map, past doors marked with symbols Maya didn't recognize, until they emerged into a private garage where a black sedan waited with its engine already running. The driver was another pale figure who nodded respectfully to Dorian, but never looked directly at Maya or Lucia. And as they drove through London's early morning streets, Maya watched a city she had never seen before reveal itself in the spaces between the ordinary world. They passed buildings that seemed to exist only in peripheral vision, shops with windows that reflected different seasons, parks where the trees whispered in languages that predated human speech. Dorian's mansion in Belgravia looked perfectly normal from the street, a Georgian townhouse that belonged to wealthy but unremarkable residents. But the moment they stepped through the front door, Maya knew she had entered someplace impossible. The entry hall was larger inside than the entire building should have been able to contain, with a staircase that spiraled upward beyond what should have been the roofline. Portraits lined the walls, and Maya could swear she saw one of the painted figures adjust his cravat as she passed. Mirrors reflected not the room she stood in, but glimpses of other times, other seasons, other decades when this house had sheltered different secrets. Elena appeared first, a woman who looked to be in her 30s with auburn hair and green eyes that held too much knowledge for her apparent age. She moved with the same fluid grace as the figures at the airport, but something about her felt more accessible, more human, until she spoke, and Maya heard the same accent that flavored Dorian's words. "Welcome to our household," Elena said, and Maya noticed that her smile never quite reached her eyes. "We have been preparing for your arrival since the moment Raphael began to heal." She gestured toward a sitting room where tea had been laid out on china, so fine it seemed to glow with its own light. But Maya caught sight of the morning newspapers spread across a side table and felt her blood turn cold. Her photographs stared back at her from the front page of several publications, accompanying headlines about missing persons and international manhunts and police investigations that had apparently begun the moment Marcus discovered her absence. Dr. Thorne joined them next, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes who examined Raphael with the gentle efficiency of someone who had been caring for children for far longer than any human lifetime could contain. The baby stirred when the doctor touched him, but immediately calmed when Maya moved closer, and she felt that golden connection flare to life again between them. "Most interesting," Dr. Thorne murmured, and Maya saw him exchange a meaningful look with Dorian. "The child responds only to her presence now, which suggests the binding has taken hold more completely than we anticipated." Finally, Miriam appeared, and Maya knew immediately that this woman was far older and more dangerous than anyone else she had met. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, and her eyes held the weight of centuries. But she moved with the predatory grace of a creature that had never been human at all. She studied Maya with undisguised suspicion, circling her like a cat evaluating potential prey, and when she spoke, her voice carried the chill of winter winds. "You have no idea what you have done," Miriam said bluntly. "Bridge magic has not manifested in over 2 centuries, and the last woman who possessed it nearly destroyed both our worlds. The baby may be healing, but at what cost? We should end this before it spreads further." Maya felt Lucia move behind her, small hands clutching at her mother's jacket, and something fierce and protective flared in her chest. Whatever these people were, whatever ancient laws and supernatural debts they claimed bound her to them, she would not let them threaten her daughter. The golden light began to build beneath her skin again, responding to her emotions, and she saw all 3 vampires take a step backward as if they could sense the power gathering in her bones. Dorian raised a hand, and the tension in the room eased slightly, but Maya could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure against her skin. "Dr. Thorne is correct," he said quietly. "The binding has taken hold, and Raphael's health is now connected to your presence. But Miriam is also right to be concerned. Bridge magic is dangerous, unpredictable, and, historically, it has ended badly for everyone involved." Maya looked down at the baby sleeping peacefully in Dorian's arms and felt the pull of that connection stronger than ever, a golden thread that seemed to tie her heart directly to his. Each time she had touched him, each time the healing light had flowed between them, she had felt weaker afterward, as if something essential was being drawn out of her and into him. Now she noticed faint silver marks beginning to appear on her skin, delicate patterns that looked almost like tattoos spreading up her arms from her palms. "You are not just healing him," Dr. Thorne explained gently. "You are taking his supernatural affliction into yourself." filtering it through human magic that was never meant to bear such a burden. The process will either kill you or transform you into something that is no longer entirely human, and we do not yet know which outcome is more likely. Maya felt the weight of that revelation settle over her like a shroud, but when she looked at Lucia's frightened face and then at Raphael's peaceful sleep, she knew the choice had already been made the moment she first touched the baby's fevered forehead. She was bound to this strange household by forces she didn't understand, connected to people who existed in the spaces between the ordinary world and something far more ancient and dangerous. Marcus would find them if they returned to the human world, but staying here meant accepting that her life and Lucia's would never be normal again. The silver marks on her skin pulsed faintly with their own light, and Maya realized that perhaps normal had never been an option for someone who could channel golden fire from her hands and heal supernatural curses with her touch. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Maya discovered that healing Raphael was becoming as necessary as breathing, and far more dangerous. Each morning she would find herself drawn to the nursery, where he slept in a crib carved from wood, so dark it seemed to absorb light, and each time she pressed her palms to his small chest, the golden radiance flowed more freely between them. Dr. Thorne called it life thread, explaining in his careful clinical voice that she possessed the rarest form of magic known to either human or vampire kind, the ability to weave life force between living beings, like a seamstress working with threads of pure existence. Most vampires consider it myth, he told her one afternoon as she sat exhausted in the nursery chair, watching Raphael sleep peacefully for the first time since his birth. But your grandmother, Maria Santos, was documented in our records as possessing this gift, and it seems the power has awakened in you at the moment of greatest need. Maya remembered her grandmother only in fragments, a small woman with weathered hands who had smelled of herbs and candle wax, who had died when Maya was 7 years old and left behind only stories that Maya's mother had dismissed as folklore. Now those stories took on new meaning as Dr. Thorne showed her ancient texts that described brujas who could heal with light, women who had served as bridges between the world of the living and the realm of supernatural beings that existed in the shadows of human civilization. But each healing session left Maya weaker, and she began to notice changes in herself that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Sunlight, which had never bothered her before, now made her skin burn and her eyes water until she found herself drawing the heavy curtains in her room and moving through the mansion like a creature of twilight. Her hearing sharpened until she could detect conversations happening 3 floors away, could hear the whispered concerns of Dorian's household staff, could catch the sound of Lucia's heartbeat from across the house. Most disturbing of all was the thirst that no amount of water could satisfy, a burning need that made her throat ache and her teeth feel strange and sharp when she ran her tongue across them. The silver marks on her skin had spread beyond her arms, delicate runes and symbols that pulsed with their own light and seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. Dr. Thorne examined them with growing concern, tracing their patterns with a finger that never quite touched her skin. "These are binding runes," he explained, and Maya heard something like fear in his usually calm voice. "They are tying your life force directly to Dorian's bloodline, creating a connection that goes far deeper than simple healing magic. If Raphael dies, the shock will kill you instantly, but if you die, the child will follow within hours. You are becoming something that has not existed for over 2 centuries, a bridge between human and vampire magic, and the process is irreversible." Maya wanted to ask if there was a way to break the connection, wanted to know if she could somehow return to her normal life with Lucia, but she could feel the truth settling in her bones like winter cold. The transformation was already too advanced to stop, and even if it weren't, she couldn't bring herself to abandon Raphael now. Each time she held him, she could feel his contentment, his growing strength, his absolute trust in her ability to keep him safe. The bond between them had become stronger than blood, stronger than the maternal love she felt for Lucia, stronger than her own survival instincts. Previous bridges have either died from the transformation itself, Dr. Thorne continued gently, or been executed by vampire courts who feared their power. The magic you wield could theoretically drain the life force from entire bloodlines, or conversely, it could grant immortality to humans who were never meant to possess it. Either outcome disrupts the careful balance that has kept our world separate for millennia. Maya absorbed this information while watching Lucia play in the mansion's impossible garden, where roses bloomed in December and fountain water flowed upward in spirals that defied gravity. Her daughter had been adapting to their new surroundings with the resilience of childhood, but Maya had begun to notice things that made her heart race with a fear that had nothing to do with supernatural debts or ancient magic. Lucia could make shadows dance by wiggling her fingers, could coax flowers to bloom by humming softly to them, could somehow convince the mansion's enchanted portraits to wave at her when she passed by their frames. The inherited magic was manifesting in her daughter just as it had in Maya herself, but Lucia was too young to understand the danger, too innocent to control power that could reshape reality with a child's careless whim. Maya realized that she was not the only one in danger from forces she couldn't control, and the weight of that responsibility made it hard to breathe. She was pulled from these dark thoughts by the sound of breaking glass somewhere in the mansion's lower floors, followed by shouts and the distinctive whine of technology that didn't belong in this supernatural sanctuary. Dorian appeared in the nursery doorway with Elena close behind him, both moving with the fluid speed that meant immediate danger. "Stay here," he commanded, but Maya was already on her feet with Raphael in her arms, maternal instincts overriding everything else. The sounds of violence were growing louder, closer, and she could hear Lucia crying somewhere in the house. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinated and professional, and equipped with weapons that made Dorian's household guards scream in pain. Maya glimpsed figures in tactical gear moving through the mansion's corridors, carrying devices that projected beams of ultraviolet light and wielding silver blades that gleamed with an inner fire she somehow knew was blessed by forces that considered vampires an abomination. At the center of the assault were two men who moved with the confidence of people who had planned this raid down to the smallest detail. Marcus looked exactly as she remembered him, his police training evident in the way he cleared rooms and directed his team, but the man beside him was a stranger who commanded attention with the same unconscious authority that Dorian possessed. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and eyes the same dark brown as Maya's own, and when he spoke, she heard echoes of her grandmother's accent in his voice. "Marcus tracked you here using every database and surveillance system the Boston police have access to," he called out as his team swept through the mansion with military precision. "But I have been hunting your bloodline for much longer than that, Maria. My name is Victor Castellanos, and I am your father." Maya felt the world shift around her as she processed this revelation, remembering her mother's bitter comments about the man who had abandoned them both, the father she had never known and stopped wondering about years ago. But Victor wasn't finished with his explanations, and his words cut through her shock like silver through flesh. "Your grandmother was not just a healer," he continued, pulling photographs from his jacket and spreading them across a table that moments before had been set for afternoon tea. "She was a bridge who died helping vampire children, and her power has been dormant in our family bloodline for 3 generations until it awakened in you." These are pictures of other bridges throughout history, women who all met violent ends after their magic grew too powerful for either humans or vampires to tolerate. Maya looked at the photographs and saw faces that could have been her own. Women with dark hair and eyes who stood surrounded by golden light, who held supernatural children in their arms, who smiled with the same mixture of love and exhaustion that she saw in her own mirror each morning. But every photograph was marked with dates of death, ages that never reached 30, and brief notations about circumstances that ranged from magical overload to execution by supernatural courts. We have come to save you from a fate that has claimed every woman in our family who has manifested this cursed gift, Victor said, and Maya heard genuine pain in his voice. I lost my mother to this magic, watched it consume her as she tried to save creatures that should never have been born. I will not lose my daughter to the same corruption. The battle escalated as Dorian's guards fought back with centuries of experience and supernatural strength, but the attackers had come prepared with weapons specifically designed to neutralize vampire defenses. Maya found herself backing toward the nursery's far wall, with Raphael clutched against her chest, while Lucia pressed herself against Maya's legs with wide, frightened eyes. The golden light was building beneath her skin in response to the danger. But this time it felt different, sharper, like sunlight concentrated through a magnifying glass until it could burn through steel. When one of Victor's soldiers burst through the nursery door with a blessed silver blade raised to strike at Dorian, Maya's magic erupted from her hands without conscious thought or control. The golden radiance that had always been warm and healing transformed into something that blazed like the heart of a star, and the soldier screamed once before crumbling to ash that scattered in the sudden wind that filled the room. Maya stared at her hands in horror, seeing power that could destroy as easily as it could heal, understanding for the first time why bridges throughout history had been feared by both humans and vampires alike. The light was still pouring from her palms in waves that made the air itself burn, and she realized that Victor's warnings about her dangerous nature had been absolutely correct. She was becoming something that could tip the balance between worlds, something that possessed the power to save or destroy entire bloodlines with a thought, something that neither side could afford to let exist unchecked. Dorian appeared at her side, his storm-colored eyes reflecting the golden fire that surrounded her, and Maya saw her own fear mirrored in his face. "We need to leave," he said quietly, and she knew that everything had changed irrevocably. The mansion was no longer safe. Victor and Marcus would not stop hunting her, and the power growing inside her was becoming too dangerous to control. But as she looked at Raphael sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaffected by the magic that had just killed a man, she knew that running away was no longer an option. The bridge between worlds had been built, and she was standing at its center whether she wanted to be there or not. The vampire court existed 3 levels beneath the London Underground, in chambers carved from stone that predated human civilization, and Maya felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her as Dorian led her through corridors lit by flames that cast no shadows. The air itself seemed thick with power and politics, with whispered conversations in languages that had been dead for millennia, with the accumulated breath of creatures who had never been human and never would be. Raphael slept peacefully in her arms, unaware that his survival had become a matter of supernatural law, while Lucia walked between Maya and Dorian with the wide-eyed fascination of a child encountering magic beyond her comprehension. The court chamber was vast and circular, with tiers of stone seats rising toward a domed ceiling painted with constellations that moved and shifted when Maya wasn't looking directly at them. Vampire nobles filled the seats, pale figures in clothing that spanned centuries of fashion, their eyes reflecting the torchlight like captured stars. At the center of the chamber stood a dais where 5 thrones waited, occupied by the vampire lords and ladies who governed supernatural society with authority that had never been questioned by human governments. Maya recognized the weight of their attention as they studied her, measuring and evaluating and finding her lacking in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Dorian had brought her here seeking protection under ancient treaties that governed supernatural interference in human affairs, but Maya could feel the hostility radiating from the assembled nobles like winter wind. Lady Vivian rose from the central throne with fluid grace that spoke of centuries spent perfecting every movement, her silver hair gleaming in the torchlight and her blue eyes cold as Arctic ice. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things were beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and pale skin that seemed to glow with its own inner light. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had never been questioned, never been denied, never been told that her will was not absolute law. Lord Ashworth brings before us a creature of unprecedented danger, she announced, and the assembled nobles murmured their agreement with the practiced synchronization of a choir that had been rehearsing for centuries. Bridges have appeared throughout history only to destabilize the careful balance that keeps our worlds separate, that protects both human and vampire society from the chaos that would result if the barriers between life and death were permanently broken. This woman possesses power that could drain the life force from entire bloodlines or grant immortality to humans who were never meant to possess it, either outcome resulting in exposure that would destroy the secrecy we have maintained for millennia. Maya felt the crushing weight of their collective judgment and understood that she was not here as a petitioner seeking sanctuary, but as a defendant facing trial by beings who viewed her existence as an existential threat to everything they had built. Dorian stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had navigated these political waters for centuries, his voice carrying the same authority as Lady Vivian's, but tempered with something that might have been genuine concern for justice. The woman acted to save my son's life, he argued, and by ancient law that grants her protection under the covenant of mercy. She had no knowledge of our world, no understanding of the consequences, no intent beyond healing a sick child. To punish her for an act of compassion would violate every principle we claim to uphold. But Lady Vivian was not swayed by appeals to mercy or justice, her cold smile suggesting that she had anticipated this argument and prepared her response long before they entered the chamber. "Ignorance does not negate responsibility," she replied smoothly, "and compassion without wisdom is the most dangerous force in any world. If she claims the protection of the covenant, then let her prove she deserves it by demonstrating control over the power that threatens us all. The court demands proof that she can heal without destroying herself or others, that her magic serves mercy rather than chaos." Maya felt her heart sink as guards brought forward a small figure on a stretcher, a vampire child who looked to be perhaps 5 years old, but whose pale skin and labored breathing suggested he was dying from the same blood plague that had been killing Raphael. The boy's dark eyes fixed on Maya with desperate hope, and she realized that the court was offering her an impossible choice between saving an innocent life and protecting herself from magic that grew more dangerous with every use. The assembled nobles watched in silence as Maya approached the dying child, feeling the familiar pull of connection that drew her to suffering she might be able to ease. But this time, the golden light that flowed from her hands felt different, sharper and more concentrated, as if her power had been refined by recent trauma into something that burned rather than warmed. The healing took everything she had and more, drawing on reserves she didn't know existed, pulling life force from her own body to replace what the plague had stolen from the child. When it was finished, the boy sat up with color returning to his cheeks and strength flowing back into his small limbs. But Maya collapsed to the stone floor as her vision darkened, and her heart struggled to maintain a rhythm that kept slipping away from her control. Blood spilled from a cut on her palm where she had fallen, and Maya watched in fascination as it began to glow with the same golden radiance that had flowed from her hands during the healing. The assembled nobles drew back in shock and fear as the blood spread across the ancient stones, illuminating runes carved into the floor that had been invisible until that moment. Lady Vivian stared at the glowing blood with an expression that mixed awe with calculation, and Maya realized that her body itself had become magical, that every drop of blood in her veins now contained power that could transform reality in ways she couldn't predict or control. "Her blood has become a substance of power," Dr. Thorne whispered from somewhere behind her, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent chamber. "It could grant immortality to humans, or cure any vampire curse, making it the most valuable and dangerous material in either world." The court erupted in whispered conversations and urgent debates about implications and precedents, and ancient laws that had never contemplated this possibility. Maya struggled to sit up, feeling weak and dizzy, and somehow fundamentally changed by what she had just done, while Dorian knelt beside her with an expression of concern that went beyond political calculation. But it was Elena who helped Maya to her feet. Elena, who had been her guide and protector throughout their time at the mansion. Elena, whose gentle hands and reassuring smile had made Maya feel like she might actually survive this supernatural nightmare. Elena, who now looked at Maya with eyes that held secrets and regret, and something that might have been genuine sorrow. I have been reporting to Lady Vivian since the night you first touched Raphael, Elena confessed quietly, her voice barely audible above the continuing debates of the assembled nobles. I believed then and believe now that your power will ultimately destroy the careful secrecy that protects vampire society from human persecution. Every bridge in history has ended in catastrophe, and you are already more powerful than any who came before. Maya felt betrayal cut through her like silver through flesh, understanding that Elena's friendship had been performance, that her guidance had been manipulation, that even here in this place of ancient power, she was surrounded by people who viewed her as a threat to be managed rather than a person to be protected. The formal dinner that followed the healing demonstration felt like a funeral, with vampire nobles discussing Maya's fate as if she weren't sitting among them. The wine served with the meal tasted of silver and starlight, and Maya noticed Elena watching her carefully as she drank, monitoring her reactions with the attention of someone waiting for a specific result. The poison worked slowly, beginning as a tingling sensation in her fingertips that gradually spread up her arms toward her heart. Elena had chosen something that would kill Maya gradually, while leaving Raphael unaffected by their connection, a mercy that felt more cruel than a quick death would have been. Dorian discovered the treachery when Maya collapsed during the third course, her body convulsing as silver-laced wine burned through her system like liquid fire. His challenge to Elena echoed through the chamber with the force of ancient law and personal fury, but Maya found the strength to intervene even as her vision blurred and her heart struggled to pump blood that had become toxic. Elena's fears were not wrong, Maya gasped, tasting metal and magic on her tongue as she fought to remain conscious. Her power was growing beyond her control, beyond her understanding, beyond her ability to predict its consequences. The bridge magic that flowed through her veins was transforming her into something that could reshape reality with a thought, and she had no framework for controlling forces that operated according to laws she had never learned. Elena had tried to kill her not from hatred, but from genuine fear of what Maya might become, and that fear was justified by every piece of historical evidence about previous bridges. Maya escaped the court with Lucia, while Dorian and his guards fought a political battle that had turned into actual combat, but Raphael remained behind as collateral for her eventual return. She carried her daughter through London's shadowy streets to the sanctuary that Father McKenna maintained for supernatural refugees, a place where the boundaries between human and vampire worlds blurred enough to offer temporary safety. The priest was a thin man with kind eyes who had been documenting bridge magic for the Catholic Church since long before Maya was born, and his archives contained records that went back centuries. "The Church has always known about your kind," he explained, as he showed Maya photographs and documents that chronicled the lives and deaths of women who had possessed her power. Bridge magic follows a predictable pattern throughout history, beginning with healing, progressing to binding, and ending with either transcendence or destruction, depending on the choices made by the bridge herself. Maya studied the records of Isabella Santos, a bridge from the 1800s, who had successfully controlled her power by accepting its dual nature rather than fighting against it. Isabella had embraced the connection between human and vampire magic, becoming a mediator who prevented wars between the species and maintained the balance that kept both worlds stable. But her success had come at a terrible price. Eternal life bound in service to both worlds, never fully belonging to either, never able to live as a normal human being again. Maya realized that she faced three impossible choices, each one requiring her to sacrifice the life she had imagined for herself and Lucia. She could let her power consume her and become a weapon of mutual destruction that would devastate both human and vampire societies. She could sacrifice herself to break the binding and save both Raphael and her own humanity, but that would leave Lucia orphaned and unprotected in a world that now knew about her inherited magic. Or she could follow Isabella's path and become an eternal guardian, trading her mortality and freedom for the power to protect both worlds from the chaos that bridge magic could unleash. Each choice meant losing the normal life she had wanted for herself and her daughter. Each path led away from the simple future she had imagined when she boarded that airplane in Boston with forged documents and desperate hopes. Victor and Marcus found the sanctuary before dawn, bringing Iron Cross forces equipped with weapons designed to neutralize supernatural defenses and capture bridge magic users alive. They used Lucia as bait, threatening to take Maya's daughter unless she surrendered herself to people who viewed her power as an abomination that needed to be contained or destroyed. Maya looked at her daughter's frightened face and knew that whatever choice she made, it would echo through both worlds for generations to come. Maya stood in the abandoned underground station beneath the vampire court, watching Victor arrange blessed silver weapons in patterns that hurt her eyes to look at directly, and realized that surrender had been the only choice that could save everyone she loved. Above them, the ancient stones of the court hummed with power that had been building for centuries, while below them, London's ley lines pulsed with energy that predated human civilization by millennia. Father McKenna moved between the silver arrangements with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting, while Dorian held Raphael and watched Maya with eyes that held secrets she was only beginning to understand. Lucia sat in a circle of protective salt that Elena had poured around her, playing with shadows that danced at her command, unaware that her mother was about to undergo a transformation that would either master the bridge magic consuming her or destroy her completely. The transcendence ritual had not been attempted in over 200 years, Dr. Thorne explained as he consulted texts so old their pages crumbled at his touch. But it remained the only known method for a bridge to gain control over life thread magic before it consumed both the wielder and everyone connected to her power. Victor had agreed to provide the blessed silver despite his hunter training, his face grim as he recalled witnessing what happened when bridge magic went uncontrolled in Prague during the 1800s. Entire city blocks had been consumed in supernatural warfare, he told them quietly. Humans and vampires alike transformed into creatures that belonged to neither world, and the only way to end the carnage had been to kill the bridge who had lost control of her gift. I will not allow that fate to befall my daughter, but neither can I permit her power to grow beyond all restraint. This ritual is the only path between those two equally terrible outcomes. Maya understood that the ceremony required three elements that would either harmonize her conflicted nature or tear her apart at the cellular level. The blood of her vampire bond represented the supernatural connection that tied her to Dorian's bloodline, a crimson thread that pulsed with ancient magic and would serve as the foundation for her transformation. The silver of human faith would provide the stabilizing force, blessed weapons forged by generations of believers who had dedicated their lives to protecting humanity from supernatural threats. And the gold of bridge magic, her own life force transformed into pure healing energy, would serve as the catalyst that either bound these opposing forces together or allowed them to destroy each other in a conflagration that would consume everything within miles. Dorian approached her as Father McKenna completed his preparations, and Maya saw something in his storm-colored eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. I have been bound to previous bridges before, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. Isabella Santos, your great-great-grandmother, saved my life in 1847 when vampire hunters cornered me in Madrid, and I served as anchor for her power until she chose to sacrifice herself to prevent a war between our kinds. It is why I have survived for over 1,000 years, why my bloodline has remained strong when others have fallen to time and circumstance, why I recognized your magic the moment you touched my son. You are not the first bridge I have loved, Maya Castellanos, and if you survive this ritual, you will not be the last. But you are the one I choose to bind my existence to, for whatever time we may have together. Maya felt the truth of his words resonate in her bones, understanding finally why the connection between them had felt so ancient and inevitable from the moment she had first seen him on the airplane. But before she could respond, before she could process the implications of what he had just revealed, the sound of breaking stone echoed through the underground station, and Marcus emerged from the tunnel entrance with blood on his hands and madness in his eyes. He had broken free from Victor's soldiers through a combination of police training and desperate fury, and the blessed silver blade he carried gleamed with holy fire as he advanced toward the ritual circle where Maya stood surrounded by ancient magic and impossible choices. I would rather see you dead than corrupted by these monsters, he snarled, and Maya realized that her ex-husband had finally revealed the depth of his hatred for anything he couldn't control or possess. You were mine, Maya, and if I cannot have you, then no one will, especially not these parasites who feed on human blood and call it nobility. His attack came without warning, the blessed blade slicing through the air toward Maya's heart with the precision of someone who had killed before and felt no remorse about killing again. But the ritual had already begun, the three elements of blood and silver and gold swirling around Maya like a hurricane made of light and shadow, and Marcus's interruption sent the carefully balanced magical forces spiraling wildly out of control. Maya felt her power explode outward in waves that turned the air itself into molten gold, transforming everything the light touched into crystalline statues that preserved every detail of expression and posture in minerals that had never existed before on Earth. Victor froze, mid-step, with his hand reaching toward his daughter, his face locked in an expression of desperate love and eternal regret. Father McKenna became living silver, his prayers captured forever in lips that could no longer move, but somehow continued to radiate faith and compassion. Elena stood like a guardian, carved from precious metal, forever poised to protect Lucia, even as the golden transformation swept over her supernatural form. Maya watched in horror as her uncontrolled magic spread through the underground station like a plague of beauty, understanding that her power, when unchecked, made no distinction between healing and destruction, between love and hate, between life and death. The golden light was transforming everyone it touched into immortal artwork, preserving them in a state between existence and oblivion that would last until the end of time itself. She could feel the transformation beginning to reach toward Lucia and Raphael, could sense her daughter's confused fear as shadows turned to gold around her small form, could hear the baby's cries as even his supernatural resilience proved inadequate against magic that remade reality according to its own incomprehensible rules. Dorian stepped forward then, his immortal form already beginning to shimmer as the golden light touched his skin, and offered himself as an anchor for her power, knowing that binding his eternal existence to her mortal life would eventually destroy them both. Take my strength, he said, his voice echoing strangely as crystalline formations began to spread across his chest. Use my immortality to contain your magic. Bind your power to my bloodline completely so that it cannot spread beyond this chamber. I have lived for 1,000 years, Maya, and I would rather spend 50 mortal years with you than face eternity, knowing I could have saved you but chose self-preservation instead. But Maya understood that accepting Dorian's sacrifice would only delay the inevitable. that binding her unstable magic to his immortal nature would create a connection so powerful it would eventually consume them both in a conflagration that would make her current loss of control seem like a candle flame compared to a forest fire. Instead, she made a choice that no previous bridge had ever attempted, reaching out with her consciousness to touch the inherited magic she could sense awakening in Lucia and the supernatural essence that kept Raphael alive despite his vampire nature. She split her bridge power between them, dividing the dangerous gift that had been concentrated in her alone, and creating a three-way bond that distributed the load among family members who loved each other more than they feared the consequences. The process nearly tore her apart at the molecular level. Her life force stretched thin as golden threads of magic flowed from her heart into her daughter, and the baby who had become like a son to her. But as the power settled into its new configuration, Maya felt the terrible pressure that had been building in her chest finally ease, the crushing weight of uncontrolled magic dispersing like storm clouds after lightning has discharged the accumulated electrical tension. Lucia would grow up with the ability to heal emotional wounds and nurture growing things. Her inherited bruja magic tempered by childhood innocence and guided by a mother who understood its true cost. Raphael would carry enough bridge power to cure his blood plague permanently, while helping other vampire children who suffered from similar supernatural ailments, his vampire nature providing the supernatural resilience needed to channel healing magic without being consumed by it. And Maya would retain just enough of her original gift to serve as the binding point between them, a living anchor who could guide and protect their combined power without being destroyed by its magnitude. The golden transformation stopped spreading, the crystalline statues beginning to crack and crumble as their occupants returned to flesh and blood and ordinary mortality. Victor stumbled forward as silver faded from his skin, reaching for Maya with hands that shook as he realized she had found a solution that preserved her humanity while mastering her dangerous gift. Father McKenna crossed himself as holy metal flowed away from his form, his prayers of gratitude audible once more as he witnessed a miracle that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between divine power and supernatural magic. Elena gasped as she returned to her usual vampiric grace, immediately moving to check on Lucia, who sat wide-eyed in her salt circle, watching golden butterflies dance around her small hands. But Marcus, who had been caught at the epicenter of Maya's uncontrolled power burst, did not return to his original form. His body had been unable to withstand the pure life force that Maya had accidentally channeled through him when he attacked her, and he crumbled to ash that scattered in the supernatural wind that still moved through the underground station. Maya felt no grief for his passing, only relief that Lucia would never again have to fear the man who had terrorized them both, and the knowledge that some deaths were necessary to protect the innocent from those who would destroy what they could not possess. The ritual was complete, the bridge magic stable in its new configuration, and Maya stood at the center of an underground station filled with people who had witnessed the impossible and lived to remember it. She was no longer entirely human, but she was not lost to the supernatural transformation that had claimed every previous bridge in history. She was something new, something unprecedented, something that represented hope for a future where love could triumph over the ancient fears that kept different worlds separate and suspicious of each other. Maya stood in the conservatory of Dorian's estate, watching Lucia coax roses to bloom in December, while Raphael giggled with delight at the butterflies that materialized from golden light around his small hands, and marveled at how much their lives had changed in just 3 months since the transcendence ritual had transformed them all into something unprecedented in supernatural history. The estate had become neutral ground where vampires could bring their sick children for healing, where humans who had been touched by supernatural magic could find sanctuary, where the ancient barriers between worlds had begun to dissolve in favor of something more complex and hopeful than the fear-based separation that had defined relationships between species for millennia. Maya's role as bridge mediator had been officially recognized by the vampire court. though Lady Vivienne's faction continued to view her with suspicion that bordered on open hostility, and she knew that their apparent acceptance masked ongoing efforts to undermine her authority through political maneuvering and carefully orchestrated incidents designed to prove that bridge magic was inherently unstable. The healing work had become routine in ways that would have seemed impossible when she first discovered her power on that airplane over the Atlantic. 3 or 4 times a week, vampire parents would arrive at the estate carrying children afflicted with blood plague or other supernatural ailments, and Maya would work with Raphael to channel healing energy that drew on their shared connection without depleting her own life force to dangerous levels. Lucia had proven essential to these sessions, her inherited Bruja magic providing emotional comfort to frightened families, while her growing ability to manipulate plant life created calming environments that helped the healing process work more effectively. The three-way bond that Maya had forged during the ritual allowed them to share magical growth in ways that Dr. Thorne was still struggling to document and understand. Maya found that she could access Raphael's vampire-enhanced senses when needed, could draw on Lucia's intuitive understanding of natural magic during particularly complex healings, could offer both children the stability and experience of her adult perspective when their developing powers threatened to overwhelm them. Dr. Thorne's research had revealed that Maya's transformed blood contained antibodies that could cure blood plague permanently, not just in individual cases, but potentially for every vampire child born in the future. However, harvesting enough of this miraculous substance for widespread distribution would require her to undergo regular bloodletting procedures that would slowly weaken her over the course of decades, trading her long-term health for the permanent elimination of a supernatural curse that had been killing vampire children for centuries. The ethical implications of this discovery had sparked heated debates within the vampire court, with some nobles arguing that Maya's sacrifice was a small price to pay for saving countless lives, while others maintained that forcing her to choose between her own welfare and the health of vampire children was a form of coercion that violated the principles they claimed to uphold. Victor had returned to London, leading an expanded Iron Cross organization that had been secretly funded by Lady Vivienne's faction, though Maya suspected the vampire nobles funding human hunters did not fully understand the weapon they had created in their pursuit of her destruction. Victor's forces had grown from a small cell of religious extremists into a sophisticated military organization equipped with technology that combined advanced surveillance systems with blessed weaponry designed specifically to neutralize supernatural defenses. His conviction that Maya's growing influence would eventually lead to vampire dominance over human society had only intensified since Marcus's death, and he had begun orchestrating attacks on vampire safe houses throughout London in an effort to force Maya into a position where she would have to choose sides in a war that would reveal what he believed was her true nature as a weapon disguised as a healer. The attacks escalated over several weeks, beginning with surveillance and vandalism of vampire-owned businesses, progressing to actual assaults on vampire refugees who had sought sanctuary in human communities, culminating in a coordinated strike against multiple supernatural safe houses across the city that forced Maya to acknowledge that neutrality was no longer an option. When Victor's forces surrounded a vampire nursery in Camden where Raphael had been helping to heal a dozen sick children, Maya realized that her hope of maintaining peaceful relations between all factions had been naive from the beginning. She arrived at the nursery to find Iron Cross soldiers in tactical gear surrounding a building that housed not just vampire infants, but also the human families who had volunteered to serve as caregivers. People whose only crime was showing compassion to supernatural children who had nowhere else to turn for help. Victor stood in the street outside the nursery, wearing body armor marked with symbols that burned Maya's eyes to look at, holding weapons that hummed with blessed energy and surrounded by followers whose faces showed the fervor of people who believed they were fighting a holy war. Through the nursery windows, Maya could see Raphael inside trying to comfort crying babies, while human caregivers huddled together in corners, and the sight of her magical son attempting to protect others despite his own terror filled her with a rage that made golden light begin to build beneath her skin. The confrontation that followed would change everything for both human and vampire societies, though Maya did not fully understand this as she stepped into the circle of Iron Cross soldiers and demanded that Victor explain why he was threatening innocent children. He responded by revealing the true scope of his organization's intelligence gathering, showing her photographs of vampire children she had healed over the past 3 months, documents that detailed her daily routines and the magical sessions she conducted at Dorian's estate, surveillance footage that proved the Iron Cross had been watching her every movement since the moment she arrived in London. "You have created an army of supernatural beings who view you as their savior," Victor told her, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had convinced himself that genocide was justice. "These vampire children you heal will grow into adults who remember your kindness, who believe humanity and vampire kind can coexist peacefully, who will use their supernatural abilities to protect a system that gives them power over normal humans. You think you are building bridges, but you are actually constructing the foundation for human subjugation." Maya realized that Victor's fear was not entirely irrational, that her healing work did create emotional bonds between herself and the vampire families she helped, that these connections could theoretically be leveraged into political influence if she were the type of person who sought power over others, rather than the ability to protect those she loved. But she also understood that his solution, killing supernatural children to prevent them from growing into adults who might pose a theoretical threat to human supremacy, was exactly the kind of thinking that had perpetuated centuries of fear and violence between species. When Victor ordered his soldiers to storm the nursery, Maya made a choice that she knew would expose both herself and the supernatural community to scrutiny they had never faced before. She stepped into Trafalgar Square at midnight, a public space filled with late-night tourists and street performers and people whose cell phones would broadcast whatever happened next to audiences around the world within minutes, and manifested her bridge magic in its full glory, for the first time since the Transcendence ritual. Golden light erupted from her skin like captured sunlight, but instead of the chaotic energy that had nearly destroyed everyone in the underground station, this radiance moved with purpose and precision that spoke of complete mastery over forces that had once threatened to consume her. Protective barriers of living light surrounded the nursery and every vampire safe house in London simultaneously, shields that could deflect blessed weapons and neutralize surveillance technology while simultaneously healing the injuries and fears of everyone they encompassed. Maya felt her consciousness expand to touch every supernatural being in the city, felt their terror and desperation and gratitude flow through the three-way bond she shared with Lucia and Raphael, felt her power evolving again into something that could protect entire communities rather than just individual patients. The cell phone videos began appearing on social media within minutes. Footage of a woman surrounded by golden fire, creating impossible barriers of light that turned bullets into flower petals and transformed blessed silver into ordinary metal. Maya knew that these images could never be explained away or covered up, that both human and vampire societies would have to acknowledge the existence of supernatural beings and the bridge magic that connected their worlds, whether they were ready for that revelation or not. Victor's final attack came when he realized that his weapons were useless against Maya's evolved power, when desperation drove him to charge directly at her with a blessed blade that should have been capable of cutting through any magical protection. Maya caught the weapon in her bare hand, feeling blessed silver burn against her palm as golden light flowed into the blade and transformed it into something else entirely. A tool of healing, rather than destruction, that she pressed into Victor's chest as healing energy flowed through him, whether he wanted it or not. The process showed him everything she had experienced since first touching Raphael on that airplane, every healing session and moment of connection and choice to prioritize compassion over fear. And Maya watched understanding dawn in his eyes as he realized that the weapon he had been fighting was actually the possibility of peace between species that had been at war for millennia. Victor collapsed to his knees in Trafalgar Square as golden light faded from Maya's skin, no longer the leader of a holy war, but simply a father who had been so afraid of losing his daughter to supernatural corruption that he had become the very monster he claimed to be fighting. The Iron Cross soldiers lowered their weapons as blessed energy drained from their equipment, leaving them with ordinary firearms that posed no threat to supernatural beings who had been protected by magic that transcended any technology humans could devise. Maya stood at the center of London's most public square, surrounded by evidence that the supernatural world existed, knowing that everything would change from this moment forward, knowing that she had chosen visibility over secrecy and cooperation over separation. The age of hiding in shadows was ending, and Maya Castellanos, the bridge between worlds, would help both species navigate the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Maya stood at the podium in the United Nations building, watching delegates from 193 countries struggle to process the revelation that vampires were not only real, but had been living among them for millennia, their faces ranging from scientific fascination to barely controlled panic as she explained how bridge magic worked and why the old system of supernatural secrecy could no longer be maintained. The cell phone footage from Trafalgar Square had spread across every social media platform within hours of her confrontation with Victor, forcing governments and religious institutions to confront the existence of beings they had relegated to folklore, and Maya found herself thrust into the role of spokesperson for an entire hidden world that had never asked to be revealed. Dorian sat in the diplomatic gallery, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that made him look like any other international consultant. But Maya could see the tension in his shoulders as vampire nobles throughout the audience evaluated whether her public exposure of their society constituted treason worthy of death or evolution necessary for survival. Some vampire houses had already issued formal declarations calling for her execution, viewing her breach of the masquerade as an unforgivable betrayal of centuries of careful secrecy, while others saw her as the architect of a new era where vampires could exist openly without the constant fear of discovery and persecution. Human governments presented equally divided responses, with some nations demanding access to Maya's healing abilities for their military applications, while others classified her as a threat to national security, requiring immediate containment or elimination. The theological implications had thrown religious communities into chaos that would take decades to resolve, as scholars debated whether vampires possessed souls, whether bridge magic represented divine intervention or demonic corruption, whether the existence of supernatural beings confirmed or challenged fundamental beliefs about the nature of life and death and spiritual redemption. Maya answered their questions with patience born from months of similar interrogations, explaining that bridge magic was not a weapon to be harnessed for national advantage, but a healing force that worked best when motivated by compassion rather than political ambition. She described the three-way bond she shared with Lucia and Raphael, the way their combined abilities allowed them to cure supernatural ailments while distributing the dangerous power among family members who loved each other enough to share both benefits and burdens. She spoke about the Bridge Institute she had established at Dorian's estate, a neutral organization that mediated supernatural conflicts before they escalated into violence, that provided medical care to both human and vampire communities, that operated under a new covenant designed to protect everyone involved in cross-species interactions. The covenant itself had taken 6 months to negotiate, with representatives from vampire houses, human governments, religious institutions, and supernatural refugee organizations working to create legal frameworks that had never existed before. Supernatural beings could now exist openly in designated areas, registering with local authorities and submitting to regular health inspections. But they were required to follow strict ethical guidelines that prohibited feeding on unwilling humans, transforming people without consent, or using supernatural abilities to gain unfair advantages in business or politics. Humans who chose to interact with supernatural beings received legal protections that guaranteed their safety, medical support that covered any supernatural exposure effects, and access to bridge healing services if they were harmed during sanctioned interactions. The process of implementing these agreements had required Maya to travel constantly, establishing institute branches in major cities while training new bridge mediators who could handle local conflicts without requiring her personal intervention. Lucia had adapted to their nomadic lifestyle with the resilience of childhood, treating airports and hotel rooms as adventures, while her budding bruja magic grew stronger with each new environment they encountered. She could now encourage plants to bloom in any climate, predict weather patterns that affected supernatural beings differently than humans, and create emotional calm in tense situations through techniques that seemed to combine inherited Spanish witchcraft with innovations entirely her own. Raphael had grown from a sickly infant into a healthy toddler whose vampire heritage manifested in enhanced senses and supernatural strength, but whose personality remained gentle and curious rather than predatory. His healing abilities had evolved to focus specifically on vampire children, and Maya often brought him to institute locations where his presence alone could comfort sick infants, while his touch could cure ailments that had puzzled supernatural medicine for centuries. The connection between Lucia and Raphael had strengthened as they grew, creating combined magical abilities that neither human nor vampire magic could fully explain. They could heal each other instantly from any injury, share memories and emotions across vast distances, and create protective shields around Maya when political tensions threatened to turn violent. Maya realized that her unthinkable act of reaching out to help a dying baby on an airplane had created not just a bridge between two existing worlds, but a bridge to an entirely new form of existence, where the boundaries between human and supernatural were no longer absolute barriers, but permeable membranes that allowed for unprecedented forms of cooperation and growth. Lady Vivian had made one final attempt to destroy Maya by targeting Lucia directly, believing that breaking the three-way bond would cause Maya's power to consume her in the same chaotic energy burst that had nearly killed everyone during the Transcendence ritual. The attack came during a formal institute ceremony in Vienna, where vampire and human dignitaries had gathered to sign expanded cooperation agreements, and Vivian had used the public setting to make her assault seem like an act of righteous justice rather than personal vengeance. But when Vivian's supernatural speed and strength collided with Lucia's protective instincts, the 4-year-old's budding bruja magic had combined with Raphael's vampire heritage to create something unprecedented in supernatural history. Instead of being overwhelmed by Vivian's ancient power, Lucia had somehow reversed the vampire's own nature, temporarily transforming her into a mortal human vulnerable to the very sunlight streaming through the ceremony hall's windows. Vivian had collapsed screaming as centuries of accumulated supernatural energy drained from her body, leaving her helpless and confused, while Lucia stood calmly holding Raphael's hand, both children surrounded by a protective field that made the air itself shimmer with golden radiance. The incident had effectively ended organized vampire opposition to Maya's work, demonstrating that the Bridge children possessed power beyond anything the vampire nobility could counter through political maneuvering or direct assault. Now, 1 year after Maya had first touched Raphael's fevered forehead on a red-eye flight to London, she found herself on another airplane traveling to establish new institute locations worldwide. But this time she moved openly as the Bridge mediator rather than a desperate woman fleeing an abusive marriage with forged documents and impossible hopes. Lucia slept peacefully in the seat beside her, occasionally murmuring in dreams that probably involved gardens where impossible flowers bloomed in response to her inherited magic, while Raphael played quietly with toys that occasionally floated in the air around him as his vampire abilities manifested in ways that delighted rather than frightened other passengers. The world had changed enough that supernatural phenomena on commercial flights no longer caused panic, though Maya still attracted attention from travelers who recognized her from news coverage or social media posts about bridge magic and the ongoing integration of supernatural communities into mainstream society. Maya's relationship with Dorian had evolved into something deeper than romance, but more complex than simple partnership. A connection built on mutual respect for their different natures and shared responsibility for children who belonged fully to neither human nor vampire worlds. Their future remained uncertain, as her mortality meant their time together was limited, while his immortality required him to consider consequences that stretched across centuries. But they had created a family structure that provided both Lucia and Raphael with stability and love, while honoring the supernatural bonds that tied them all together. A nervous mother across the aisle struggled with a feverish baby, whose cries reminded Maya powerfully of that first night when she had encountered Raphael's supernatural illness, and without conscious thought, she found herself making eye contact with the worried woman. Maya smiled gently and reached across the space between them to touch the child's forehead, feeling familiar golden warmth flow from her palm as bridge magic eased the infant's discomfort with the same healing energy that had started this entire journey. The fever broke immediately, the baby's cries subsiding into peaceful sleep, and Maya expected the mother to react with confusion or fear or demands for explanations about what had just happened. Instead, the woman simply looked into Maya's eyes with the recognition of one mother acknowledging another's gift and said quietly, "Thank you," with acceptance that spoke of a world where magic had become part of everyday experience rather than something to fear or deny. Maya realized that her unthinkable act of reaching out to help a stranger's child, despite the personal risk, had become not just possible, but necessary, that the bridges she had built between worlds were now being crossed daily by thousands of people who chose compassion over caution, understanding over prejudice, love over fear. The new world they were creating together would be shaped by countless such choices, each small act of connection adding another span to the bridge between what was and what could be, each moment of trust between strangers contributing to a foundation strong enough to support the weight of transformation that would reshape both human and supernatural societies for generations to come. Maya looked out the airplane window at dawn, breaking over a landscape where bridge children played in parks while their vampire and human parents watched from benches, where the impossible had become everyday magic, where the unthinkable had become the foundation for a new kind of hope that neither species could have achieved alone, but together could build into something magnificent enough to justify every sacrifice the journey had required.